أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا تسبوا الذين يدعون من دون الله فيسبوا الله عدوا بغير علم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. We have over these nights been discussing Nahjul Balgha, but there is no way to discuss this work in some depth and some comprehensive nature without talking about some of the politics and the issues pertaining to government within Nahjul Balgha. Because most of the sermons and lectures that are collected are during the time of Imam's Khilafah. And as such, there are two main areas that we can look at regarding government and regarding rulership in Nahjul Balgha. The first is a specific study that we can look at how Imam interacted with his enemies, with those who opposed him, and that inshallah will be the topic of tonight's discussion. And then another way is to look at his governship in general and see the justice of Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. But before approaching this discussion tonight, it's important to have a prerequisite, and that is of respect. Because there are certain topics which are quite controversial and they cause some difficulties between some sects in Islam. When it comes to discussing the Sahaba or anything which can be seen as contentious between them, our brothers in the school of Ahl Sunnah, they often object to it. And it is very important that we maintain etiquettes when approaching these kind of issues out of respect for our brothers in the school of Ahl Sunnah. And this is a Quranic injunction. Allah says in the verse that I just recited, Surah number 6, verse 108, do not revile those upon whom they call other than God. Otherwise they will turn and revile your God. Now, this refers to the people of Jahiliyyah when they had reference to other gods. But the message is universal. If someone else respects something or someone, even if we don't have that same level of respect directly for that person, out of respect for the people we are discussing, we accord them an extra layer of respect. And Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, he says this very principle regarding his own enemies in Sermon 206. He says, I dislike that you abuse them. But if you describe their deeds and the situations, that would be a better mode of speaking and a better way of convincing. So this is the instruction of the Imam, to approach these kinds of discussions with respect and also, of course, with intellectual rigor, which is inshallah what we're going to try and do tonight. That's one of the ways that we can ensure that we are putting truth forward, because respect is respect, but there is a limit. We don't compromise on what we believe to be the truth simply because it might offend somebody else, right? And we don't expect the reverse either, because in the school of Ahl Sunnah, for example, the character of Hazrat Abu Talib, the father of Imam Ali, he is, according to authentic traditions in the school of Ahl Sunnah, he has gone to hellfire, wal-'iyadu billah, which is completely and utterly antithetical to what we believe. But we don't expect, out of respect, that they say, oh, I'm speaking to a Shia, so I'm going to say, no, he's going to heaven. Of course not. They wouldn't do that, and we wouldn't want them to do that, because where is the benefit of a fruitful discussion? So, respect, but intellectual rigor. But in order to approach this discussion of Imam's interactions, specifically with Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, it's important to have some background. And that's what we'll spend the first third, inshallah, of tonight's discussion doing. Then we'll look at the letters specifically that Imam exchanged with Muawiyah, and then his discussion on etiquettes in war. Those are the three sections. Now, the third Khalifa, because this is where the context begins, the third Khalifa, Uthman ibn Affan, very highly respected in the school of Ahl Sunnah, and he is said to be the third of the main companions of the Holy Prophet. Now, for whatever his virtues are, it is undeniable that he had nepotistic tendencies. And there is no problem in saying this, because it is well evidenced by history. What does nepotism mean? It means that he put his family members in power simply because they were his family members. And we'll look at a couple of examples just to establish this very sensitive point. Number one, he replaces Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, one of the 10 companions who in the school of Ahl Sunnah is promised paradise. He fires him as governor of Kufa, and he puts a man called Walid bin Uqba in. Walid bin Uqba being his half-brother. Walid bin Uqba is a man who in Sahih Muslim, in the book of legal punishments, and I'm only in this discussion, by the way, because it's not the main focus of tonight, I'm only focusing on the most authentic, the most accepted aspects of history. There's much more that can be said, and there are more individuals to be had as well. But focusing just on the authentic. In Sahih Muslim, it's mentioned that Walid bin Uqba, he's leading Salatul Fajr. He finishes 2 rak'at, then he turns around and he says to the Jama'ah, should I read more or is that enough? What an unusual thing to do in the middle of your salah, and very soon afterwards he vomits. Why? Because he is completely and utterly intoxicated with alcohol. The governor of the Muslims of Kufa. He is taken to Uthman ibn Affan and he's found guilty. And this is the same man who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls a fasiq in the Quran. Walid bin Uqba. In Surah Hujurat, verse number 6, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا أَن تُصِيبُوا قَوْمًا بِجَهَالَاتٍ فَتُصْبِحُوا عَلَى مَا فَعَلْتُمْ نَادِمِينَ. If a fasiq comes to you with news, you must verify it, you must double check it. And again, the Mufassirin, there are several of the great Mufassirs who say this verse was revealed about Walid bin Uqba. For example, Jalaluddin al-Suyuti in Tafsir Durr Manthur, he has a tradition about this with a very reliable chain of narration as per the scholars of Ilm al-Rijal. But it's also mentioned, for example, in Tafsir Qurtubi, Tafsir al-Tabari, and many other tafsirs, because it is a very well-known event. That's one example of the nepotism. Another example is Amr ibn al-As, the man who conquered Egypt, Muawiyah second in command, would later be Muawiyah second in command. He is removed from his post as governor of Egypt, and he is replaced by a man called Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh, who is the foster brother of the third Khalifa, Uthman ibn Affan. And this Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh, he's the same man who, in Sunan Abu Dawud, in the book of Jihad, in a tradition which Sheikh Albani, one of the great scholars of Ilm al-Rijal, says is sahih, he says that when the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, when he conquered Mecca, he said, you must not kill anyone except for 4 people. This is according to this tradition. And one of those people that was allowed to be killed on that day because of his crimes against the Muslims was a man called Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh. And he's about to be killed, but then the third Khalifa, Uthman ibn Affan, he intercedes on his behalf. And the Holy Prophet, he doesn't say anything until Uthman, he takes Abdullah away. And then Rasulullah, full of disappointment, says, I wish one of you loyal companions of mine killed this man here. Imagine what kind of a person Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh must be, that Rasul of mercy, the Rasul of Rahmah, wishes for his death. And he is the man who is put in charge as the governor of Egypt. Another man is called Al-Hakam, the father of Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Baladuri and Ibn Athir and other sources as well say that he was banished by Rasulullah. He was removed from the city. And after he was removed, the first Khalifa was asked, petitioned, can you bring him back? The first Khalifa said no. The second Khalifa was petitioned, he said no. But when Uthman ibn Affan became Khalifa, because he was his paternal uncle, he brought him back, he invited him into his palace, into his house, when he had nothing but rags, and as he leaves his house, he's wearing the finest of silk clothing. This is according to these traditions. And one of these three, as Waqidi and Tabari mentions, the second, Ibn Abi Sarh, he actually tried to change the wordings of the Holy Quran. So the crimes of these people are quite profound. And these are only three examples. There are more, and there are more things to be said about these three as well, but only sticking to what is accepted historical fact. So with this nepotism, there came some problems. And after the Muslims, they did well in the first part of his Khilafah. During the second part of Uthman ibn Affan's Khilafah, things went downhill. And people began to protest, and they surrounded the house of the third Khalifa. And they were ready to attack against him. Now, there were many Muslims there who tried to prevent it. And one of the most important was Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Now, Uthman ibn Affan, he asks Imam Ali for help, because Imam was very good at mediating between the rebels and Uthman. In sermon number 239, Imam Ali makes reference to this. And I'll say the numbers of the sermons and the lectures so that anyone who wants to look at it in more detail, they can do so afterwards. So sermon number 239, he says that Uthman, he asks for my advice, but he doesn't fully take it because he had other influences, namely Marwan ibn al-Hakam. But Imam is there advising him. And according to Ibn Kathir in Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, not only is Imam Ali there defending the house of Uthman, not only is he mediating, he also puts his sons, Imam al-Hasan, Imam al-Hussein, to help guard him. To the point that Imam al-Hasan is actually hurt, he's injured in the attack, according to Ibn Kathir. And as things get worse for him, he starts sending out messages to ask for help. His house is under siege for about 40 days. There are different narrations, but he's under siege for a long time. So he asks for help from many people, including Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan in Syria. And this is recorded in Tarikh Ya'qub, which is from our brothers in the school of Ahl Sunnah. Muawiyah, he mobilizes an army, which he sends out to the outskirts of Syria, but he tells them to stop. Wait there, let's see what happens. And in Tarikh Ya'qubi, it's also narrated that Uthman got very angry at Muawiyah and said, you're doing this because you want me to die so that you can take Khilafah. So Muawiyah did not support him when he needed help. Now, after some time, after the protests continued and the bad advice of Marwan ibn al-Hakam, people infiltrated his house. There's different narrations, but some say that they came from the roof from a surrounding building, and then they killed Uthman ibn Affan inside of his house, which was an unjust assassination. It was a murder. And after this, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he becomes Khalifa. Now, he knows that people are using the name of Uthman ibn Affan for their own benefit. A number of people rise up against Imam Ali, and all of this, by the way, everything is accepted historical fact. And they are using his name in order to rise up for their own political purposes. People say that Imam Ali alayhi salam, he has not done enough to get after the killers of Uthman, that he hasn't brought them to justice. Not that he was amongst the killers, no one fully, people may have said that in words, but when you analyze things in reality, it wasn't the accusation of killing him because he was clearly defending him, but it was in terms of bringing them to justice. And Imam, he says, in Sermon 137, he points out the fact that the very people who are rising up for the justice of Uthman ibn Affan are the same ones who either called for protests against him or are the ones who refused to help him, like Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan. And there's lots of similar lectures like this in Nahjul Balgha, Sermon 22, Sermon 30, lecture number 6, so on and so forth. And the irony is that those who rose up, one of whom was Muawiyah, right? They rose up with one excuse. So a Sahabi of the Holy Prophet is killed, the Khalifa of the Muslims. And so they rise up in order to do one thing, which is to bring the killers of Uthman ibn Affan to justice. And the one thing that they absolutely did not do, what Muawiyah did not do when he becomes Khalifa, is bring the killers of Uthman to justice. Because Imam Ali alayhi salam had already done whatever could be done in that respect. And so there is an irony behind that. The solution to the murder of one of the Sahaba of the Holy Prophet is to go out and cause the deaths of thousands of other Muslims. In the civil wars, Battle of Jamal, Battle of Siffin, more Muslims were killed in those two battles alone than were killed in every single battle the Holy Prophet ever fought during his entire lifetime. It was a very, very difficult time for the Muslims. And Imam actually charged Muawiyah with this. In letter number 10 of Nahjul Balgha, he says, you think you're coming out to avenge Uthman's blood? You know how Uthman's blood was shed. If you want justice, go get it in Syria. There's a number of different ways to read it. But then Imam, he becomes Khalifa reluctantly. Sermon number 3. By him who split the grain and created all living beings, if my supporters did not come and exhaust all arguments, saying essentially that it is your responsibility to become Khalifa, to bring good to the Muslims and to look after the oppressed, I would have thrown the rope of this Khilafah on its shoulders. And when people give allegiance to Imam Ali, they come in droves. Even though Imam set people in the crowd saying, if you don't want to give allegiance, there's no force here. And in sermon number 3, he says that so many people came, and they came like sheep and like goats, that they almost crushed Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein, and even the clothes Imam Ali was wearing, they got ripped because people were so eager to give their allegiance to the Imam. And one of the battles that took place under the excuse of avenging the killers of Uthman was the battle of Siffin. And this is the battle where Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, he fights against Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And Imam gives the most charitable possible summary of the events running up to this in lecture number 58 of Nahjul Balgha. And essentially he says that number 1, there's no theological difference here. This is a political fight, right? So let's look at the politics. And if you're saying that the killers of Uthman need to be avenged, let's wait for this madness to end. And then when things die down a little bit, we'll be able to fulfill every criteria of justice that you want. But of course they refused, because that wasn't the real reason they were rising up. And it was written, Imam, he says, that they wanted to settle it by war. So they refused his offer, and war spread its wings, and it came to stay. Its flames rose and became strong until the war had bitten them as well as bitten us, pierced its talons into them as well as piercing its talons into us. And only after they were defeated at the Battle of Siffin, after Imam was victorious there against Muawiyah, then at the last moment before Malik al-Ashtar, the general of the Imam, got to him to finish him off, they put the Quran on spears. And they said, this Quran is what is between us. This will judge between us. And you can imagine the frustration of the first Imam, because he was saying from the very beginning, this is the Quran between us. And he didn't want all these thousands of Muslims to die. And now they put it on. It was obviously a propaganda tool. But unfortunately, Imam's army contained a lot of disloyal men, and they accepted Muawiyah's desire for truce. There was an arbitration, and essentially it ended with deception, and there was a ceasefire. Muawiyah went back to Syria. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he went back as well. And again, there's lots of details. It's a very interesting chapter of Islamic history, and a very sad one as well. But some people, when they look at these events, because nobody can look at what Muawiyah did and say that what he did was the right thing. He is someone who rose up against the rightfully guided Khalifa of his time. So some people say, well, it was ignorance, that he tried his best, and ijtihad, right? If someone tries to do ijtihad, they're working very hard to come up with a conclusion from available evidence, and they get the wrong answer, they get 1 reward, and if they get the right answer, they get 2, right? So Muawiyah was working difficult circumstances, and so he tried what he could. And we shouldn't judge. But the thousands of corpses of Muslims that lied on the earth, they're crying out for justice. And look at the situation. Uthman ibn Affan is killed, one of the prominent companions of the Holy Prophet. So what's the response? To rise up and have tens of thousands of Muslims killed. And then as a result of that, afterwards not even getting the justice, which was the claim for coming into power in the first place. There's no ignorance is not an excuse here. And Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, he says this as well in lecture number 30 of Nahjul Balgha. He says, fear Allah and turn to understand, for you will not be excused on the grounds of ignorance. Certainly the path of obedience, there are clear signs, shining ways, straight highways, and a fixed aim. So what is Imam talking about here? That there are clear signs where haqq and batil is. We've looked at a few of those traditions over these nights. Because he's not fighting against any khalifa. He's not fighting against any ordinary man. He's fighting against Ali ibn Abi Talib. This is the man who he stands against. And remember, the Holy Prophet, he says, in Sahih Muslim and Sahih Tirmidhi, for example, in 2 Sahih Hadith, that I leave behind you 2 weighty things: the Quran and my Ahlul Bayt. And in Tirmidhi it says in the Sahih Hadith that they will not separate until they meet at the pond of Kawthar. So he's fighting against what Rasulullah has said is one of my main inheritances to you, Imam Ali. In Al-Hakim's Mustadrak, in a tradition that is Sahih by Shaykh Al-Albani, the Holy Prophet, he says to his companions, amongst you is one who will fight for the interpretation of the Quran as I fought for its revelation. And it was Imam Ali. In Sahih Muslim, there's the occasion of the Mubahala that is recorded, that anyone who stood against Imam Ali alayhi salam would be amongst the Kadhibeen. Ali is with the truth is with Ali. Ali is with the Quran is with Ali. These are clear signs. But not just these general statements from the Holy Prophet, because he knew what was going to come. He gave specific ones as well, so that for posterity there is no doubt. Specifically for Siffin, 2 traditions. Sahih Muslim, in the book of the virtues of Imam Ali, the Holy Prophet, he said, Ya Ali, no one will love you except a mu'min, no one will hate you except a munafiq. And what more opposition can you get than raising an army to try and vanquish someone? But if that's not specific enough, let's go even more specific. Sahih al-Bukhari, in the book of fighting in the way of Allah, there is a description of the building of the Masjid of Quba, the first masjid that was built in the history of Islam. And in this building, the Muslims, they would take, this tradition mentions that each Muslim would take 1 brick. From one area, they would take the brick, they would move it across and put it down. But there was one companion who worked so sedulously that he would gather 2 bricks at a time. And so much so that he almost fell unconscious. And the Holy Prophet, out of love, he came up to Ammar ibn Yasir, who was this companion. And he said, Oh Ammar, as he cleared the dust from his face in a loving fashion, Oh Ammar, may Allah bless you. May Allah be merciful to you, Ammar. But he says, تَقْتُلُهُ الْفِئَةُ الْبَاغِيَةُ, that this Ammar will be killed by a rebellious group. The term baghi, it is a very derogatory term regarding a person who fights against the rightful leaders of their time. And where was Ammar ibn Yasir killed? Where was he martyred? In the Battle of Siffin. When he was fighting against whom? Against Muawiyah. And the tradition doesn't stop there. The tradition continues. Ammar will invite them to obey Allah while they will invite him to the fires of hell. Ignorance is no excuse. These traditions were well known, and Muawiyah, he also knew it. He had this furtive respect for Imam Ali. We've looked at a couple of traditions so far, but here's another one. And there was a lady by the name of Suda, and she went to Muawiyah when he was Khalifa, and she said to him that your governor in Yemen, the person who you have put in power here, he is oppressive, and he has taken the land from the lovers of Ahlul Bayt. He's taken the land away from us. And Muawiyah recognized her and said, you're one of those people who supported Ali ibn Abi Talib at the Battle of Siffin, aren't you? She said, yes, I was on his side. So he said to her, leave. I've got nothing to give you. But as she leaves, she's crying, she recites some poetry. And she says, peace be upon the body in whose grave justice was also buried. And when Muawiyah hears these eloquent lines, he stops her. And he says, tell me, who are you speaking about? She said, of course I'm speaking about Ali ibn Abi Talib. So Muawiyah asks for more information. Tell me more. Because he was interested in Imam's wonderful personality. She said that when Imam was Khalifa, there was one of his governors who did something which was not right. And so I went to the Khalifa, I went to Imam Ali, and I spoke to him. It was before the time for Salah, and he was ready to delay it for a few moments just to listen to my plea. And then afterwards he wrote a letter to me. He apologized personally, the Khalifa apologized to me. And he wrote a letter that I was to take to his governor, and in the letter it was written, thank you for your services, but you are dismissed for what you have done. This was the way that Imam Ali was just. That he looked after the cries of even the most poor, the most oppressed, the ones who had no influence. And when Muawiyah heard this, the respect welled in his heart, and he said, stop. Whatever land was taken from you, you can have it back. And she said at this moment, no, that's not enough. What about my people? What about my followers? What about the people with me there? He said, fine, their land will be returned to them as well. All in the shadow of the justice of the Imam. And Imam knew that the Umayyads, they had this respect for him. Sermon number 75, the Umayyads' knowledge about me did not stop them from accusing me. My precedence in Islam did not keep off these ignorant people from blaming me. Uncertainties should be put before the Quran and the Book of Allah, and that is where the judgment should take place. So, this is the sort of context around which Imam is engaging with Muawiyah, who is his enemy at the time. Now, during this time, he sends a number of letters over to Muawiyah, and he has a number of discussions and arguments with him. But the most important thing is that when he engages as a prerequisite to any of this, principles over results. The Ahlul Bayt, they followed in the Sunnah of Rasulullah. The Holy Prophet was in many states. Many times there were opportunities that came to him that he could compromise the truth a little bit, temporarily, in order to bring more Muslims into Islam, and then he could fix things later on. But never. If they put the sun in his right hand and the moon in his left, he never compromised. And it was the same for Imam Ali, because they weren't doing things just for that time. They were doing it for all eternity, resonating with the frequency of God. And so some of the companions of Imam in Sermon 126, they approached him, they said, Ya Ali, you should placate your enemies. And the expression they used is, they said, sew the dog's mouth shut with a big morsel. It was an Arabic expression, which means if there is a dog that is barking or that is attacking you, throw it a large piece of meat. Give it something of what it wants, because then it gets busy on eating that thing, and then it can't harm you. In other words, give them a little bit, right? Don't be so intransigent. Let them have something what they are after. Imam, he responded by saying, by Allah, do you really ask me to go through injustice and sacrifice the justice on my subjects for political gain? By Allah, as long as one star follows the other in the sky, I will never do this. Allah. And he says that if it was my own property, I would not allow injustice to come from this, and you're asking me to do it with the property of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was not consistent with the justice of the Imam, as we'll discuss more in tomorrow night's discussion. And there are lots of lectures that allude to this, that there were small compromises that were requested. Muawiyah, for example, he wanted Syria. Imam responds in lecture number 17, also lecture number 65. And it would have helped his situation, because Imam, his army were full of people who weren't loyal, because it is more difficult to be loyal to goodness and justice, because it is a hard path. Whereas the other side, there was a lot of more money, there was a lot less etiquettes. So it was easier for Muawiyah to garner through other means like deception people on his side. And hence the Imam says, this is a very painful line in Nahjul Balgha, sermon number 97, by Allah, I wish that Muawiyah would exchange dinars for dirhams, so that he would take 10 of you and give me 1 of his. This is the Imam addressing his own soldiers. And we can see that reflected in the world today. When there is a just cause, how many people are loyal to the truth and how many people are loyal to money, or loyal to their party politics, or loyal to some other thing which falls below the level of truth in their eyes. So this was the prerequisite. And another example of the prerequisites regarding the justice of Imam is that he never sunk down principles over results. He says in Sermon 200, by Allah, Muawiyah is not more cunning than I am, but he deceives and he commits evil deeds. Had it not been for the reprehensibility of deceit, I would have been the most cunning of all men. But in every deceit there is a sin, in every sin there is the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and every deceitful person will be recognized by a banner on the day of judgment, and I will not be made forgetful by this strategy, nor will I be overpowered by hardships. Imam knew he could have lied. Imam knew he could have used propaganda. Imam could have been more cunning than anybody. But he wasn't, because he was adherent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rule. But he still used psychology. Remember, we discussed there's a lot of psychology in Nahjul Balgha. Although he does not lie and deceive, he still uses a lot of very smart ways to get back at Muawiyah. For example, in lecture number 64, he writes to Muawiyah, second in command, Amr ibn al-As, and he describes him, he says, you are like the hyena that follows the lion, that simply licks its paws and it waits for whatever remains to fall off from the lion's prey. And this was a big blow to the pride of Amr ibn al-As, because he's the conqueror of Egypt, right? He's a very competent general, and this is the truth. And this clearly had an impact on Amr, as we'll see later on. And he also wrote to Ziyad bin Abi, one of the key followers of Muawiyah, in letter number 44. Now, whenever Imam he writes to Muawiyah, one of the things you'll find is all of his letters are full of Quranic injunctions, ahadith, and teachings of Islam. Letter number 28, for example, full of verses from the Holy Quran. And in Sermon 180, Imam Ali says that I have taught you the Quran, and I forced you to swallow that which you were spitting out, and I taught it with such clarity that the blind would see and the sleeping would wake. That's how much he relied on the Quran when he was discussing with his opponents, with Muawiyah. And there are many lectures where he does this. Letter number 10, for example, he reminds Muawiyah about the Day of Judgment. And from these responses from the Imam, we can take personal lessons as well. Because the way that the Imam deals with his adversaries, that is the way in which we can deal with challenges and problems that we come across as well. Another aspect of the Imam's interactions with Muawiyah is that he was very precise in answering specifically the arguments that Muawiyah gave. Logically, he broke them all down. Now, Nahjul Balgha, it is full of these. Any of the letters to Muawiyah, you'll find usually there's at least one or two specific rebuttals. But we'll look at one example. Letter number 17. Muawiyah, he tries to make the argument that what's the difference between you? You're from Banu Hashim, I'm from Banu Umayyah, but we all go back to a man called Abd Manaf. So they're related. Distantly related, but they're related. And so Imam responds. He says, as for you saying that we are both from Abd Manaf and therefore we are the same, there is no truth in this whatsoever. For no Umayyah can be like Hashim, nor could Harb be like Abdul Muttalib, nor could Abu Sufyan be like Abu Talib. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The Muhajir cannot be a match for him who was set free. Muhajirun are those who accepted Islam in Makkah right at the beginning, whereas those who were set free are those who were forced into Islam after the conquest of Makkah, who converted when they had no other choice. Besides that, we have the distinction of prophethood, through which the strong were subdued and the downtrodden were raised up, and Allah made the Islam come into their hearts. People submitted to Islam willingly or unwillingly, and you were amongst those who were unwilling and entered it from greed. And now do not allow shaitan to have a share with you, nor to have a sway over you. That indeed is the end of the matter. So there are many examples. This is just one example where Muawiyah will make a specific point. Imam Ali breaks it down logically, and he responds to each of the breakdown points. And that is the most important thing that we should do when we are arguing or discussing with anybody as well, to approach it with rationality. And another aspect, though, is that Imam dealt with a lot of specious arguments as well. For example, there was a lot of use of what are known as red herrings, which are arguments that are used to distract. Or another tactic which is often used is called gish galloping, which means just to throw a whole bundle of arguments forward in the hope that there's so many here, none of them can properly be fully discussed. And Imam Ali, he responds, number one, saying number 243, when replies are numerous, the correct point remains obscure. So if there are too many points you're trying to deal with in one discussion, then you won't get to the bottom of it. Because everything will be superficial, you can't dissect it in enough depth. So try and avoid that. And then he puts this into action. In letter number 64, he says, you said that I killed Talha, I killed Zubair, and I forced Lady Aisha out of her house into another house. These matters have no concern with you, they don't involve you, and they have nothing to do with you. And therefore no explanation is due to you. That's it. This attempted distraction to go away from what they were arguing about has got nothing to do with you. Let's move on to the real topics at hand. That's the only way to respond to a red herring. Or if someone's trying to gish gallop, focusing on the arguments which are important and dismissing those which are not. And when absurdities are put forward, dismissing them entirely as well. It's important to attack back after all arguments have been exhausted, after all logical responses have been given, and still if things are being put forward which are deliberately absurd, which are ridiculous, to the point that if you logically respond to it, you're giving it weight. You're saying, okay, this is something that needs to be dealt with. Imam, he responds in letter number 65, for example, I have received your letter, which is full of uncouth utterances, which weaken the cause of peace, and nonsensical expressions which have not been brought together with knowledge or forbearance. By reason of these things, you have become like the person who is sinking deep down in a marsh, or someone who is in the darkness desperately groping upwards. Meaning that now that Imam has managed to conquer all of his arguments, he's groping in the dark, throwing whatever he can just to try and build this position. And at that point, if we're engaging with someone and we realize they're not being honest in this discussion, that there is a disingenuous approach to things, then yes, we have to say no. I identify the fact this is not an honest discussion, and therefore it is not worth more dissection of these points. And often, in that same vein, Imam would turn the lens on Muawiyah. For example, and this is using the person's logic against him. Now, again, remember, all of this is after we have done these logical breakdowns, because otherwise it becomes whataboutism, or an ad hominem, which means someone accuses us of something and we say, well, what about that other person? Or what about you, right? But that doesn't address the logic of what's being said. So Imam responds logically, but when they keep coming, then he also adds in a response by taking the logic that Muawiyah uses and turning it against him. For example, in lecture number 37, he says, as for you prolonging the question of Uthman's murder, so Imam has already responded multiple times, the position is that you helped Uthman when it benefited you, and when he needed you, you abandoned him. And that is the end of the matter. So this is one of the ways to respond. And another aspect of Imam's interactions with his enemies was that he would be better rather than appearing better. Sometimes, particularly in politics, people are so focused on their appearance, they forget the fact that they actually have to be the thing that they're claiming to be. And Imam, he manifests this so beautifully in so many interactions with his enemies. There's one example in Nahjul Balgha, which is quite clear. It's not with Muawiyah, but it's with another of his adversaries. Sermon number 170. There is a discussion with a man called Kulayb al-Jarmi. And Kulayb, he comes to the Imam. He says, I am a messenger from Basra, because the city of Basra rebelled against Imam Ali. And he says that I have come to discuss these issues. So Imam discusses with him about the Battle of Jamal, with so much detail and such brilliant arguments, that at the end he puts his hands up, he says, I acknowledge what you're saying is the truth, Ya Ali. So Imam puts out his hand, he says, then give me your allegiance. And Kulayb says, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? I'm a messenger, I'm coming on behalf of my city, I can't do anything rash, okay? So give me a bit of time. It's a classic politician kind of approach, right? As soon as you realize you're in trouble, try and retreat. Sometimes it's the Motte and Bailey fallacy. And so Imam says, okay, that's fine, but think about this analogy. He says that if your town sent you out to go and find some fertile pastures with good grass and good soil, and you went out to a place and you were 100% convinced you found the best place, and you went back to your town and you told them about what you saw with your own eyes, but they said, yeah, thanks for the information, but I think we'll go to the opposite direction, to the middle of the desert. Imam says, if that was the case, would you go with them to the desert? Kulayb, he said, that I of course I wouldn't. And he says, and this is also corroborated by Waqidi and Tabari, he says, by Allah, the argument was so clear, in that moment I could not refrain from giving my bay'ah to Ali ibn Abi Talib. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Another aspect of the way that the Imam interacts with Muawiyah is paying attention to framing, to the optics of the situation. And Imam, for example, points out in lecture number 10, he talks about the fact that, again, remember, Imam was calling them to the Quran, they didn't come to the Quran, and then the Battle of Siffin took place, then they put the Quran on spear, saying the Quran is between us. Imam Ali points out, in the moment, it might look like they are being sincere, but when you put it into context, it all breaks down. He says in lecture number 10, you called me to war, and now that war is cutting you with its teeth and you're crying like camels under a heavy load, now that you are bewildered by the incessant striking of the swords and the occurrence of death and the falling of bodies, now you call me to the Quran? So he doesn't allow the opponents to reframe the discussion in a way that is not appropriate. And we can see this in many political discussions today. People will start by taking a very blinkered approach, forgetting the history, forgetting the context. And Imam responds by saying, no, context is essential. You can't analyze this event without knowing the broader picture. Things didn't start on, for example, a certain date. You have to go back in history. And Imam is soft when required. Imam is harsh when required. He's harsh, for example, in Sermon 77, saying this Banu Umayyah, they're giving me my haqq bit by bit, but by Allah, if I survive, I will remove them in the same way that a butcher removes the dust-covered meat from his meat. Meaning if there's a piece of meat that's fallen on the floor, that there's a part which is dirty, the butcher chops it off without mercy. Imam Ali says that the way they are acting, I will do the same with them. So there is harshness when required, but there is also softness. Because he says in saying number 11, that when you gain power over your adversary, out of shukr to Allah, forgive them. Obviously within certain contexts, but he says forgive them. That is the price that you try and give to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for your victory. And in his interactions with Muawiyah, he also introduces us to some of the beautiful etiquettes of war. Now, in his interactions, we see, for example, that we start by praying to God. So before, in that section, we saw how to interact with our enemies, what kind of approaches Imam Ali uses in what kind of situation. But now that we've reached the point of war, now that things have gone this far, then Imam gives us another set of instructions by his living example. And when it comes to the time of war, and we can contextualize this in our own lives, it might, may not protect us on the battlefield, but it might be if we're dealing with adversaries at work, if we're dealing with people who are causing problems in our day-to-day lives, we can take some of these messages and try and translate them to there. And so, Imam says, you start by praying to God. Always start by praying to God. Lecture number 15, oh my God. Hearts are drawn towards you, the necks stretched towards you, the eyes are fixed on you, the steps are towards you. The bodies have turned lean in devotion to you, my God. Hidden animosity has become manifest and the cauldrons of malice are boiling. And then he reads the verse of the Quran, رَبَّنَا افْتَحْ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَ قَوْمِنَا بِحَقِّ وَأَنْتَ خَيْرُ الْفَاتِحِينَ. That, oh my Lord, decide between us and our people with the truth, because you are the best of deciders. Why is it so important to start with God? Because God is the epicenter of goodness. Allah represents absolute goodness in its most pure of forms. So whenever you're entering into something where where we're dealing with our adversaries, it is very easy to slip one way or the other into oppression or into being too forgiving, and that you allow them to cause you more harm. So in these kind of areas, we remember Allah at the epicenter of our consciousness so that we don't slip and do things that we should not do. Number one. And Imam, he does this practically in his life as well. Another aspect that he says regarding this is try and avoid war as much as possible. And there's a few examples where we see this, 4 main areas. Number 1, in letter number 10, Imam Ali, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, he issues a challenge to Muawiyah, and he says, you called me to war. Better leave the people to one side and come out to me one-on-one and spare both parties from fighting, so that it may be known which one of us has a rusted heart and covered eyes. But remember, I am Abul Hasan. I am the one who killed your grandfather. I am the one who killed your brother. I am the one who killed your uncle by cutting them to pieces at the Battle of Badr. And the sword I used to do so is still with me, and it is borne by a man with the same heart. Spare others from the collateral damage. Come, face me one-on-one. Now, of course, naturally we know that nobody would face Imam Ali one-on-one on the battlefield, not lest Muawiyah. But remember that letter to Amr ibn al-As? It has an impact. Because Amr, when he heard about this, he said, Muawiyah, this is a good opportunity. Muawiyah, this is a chance where we could win outright. And Muawiyah got upset and he said, you only want me to go and fight because you want to take khilafah for yourself. So Imam, he had an impact on these people. Number one. Number two, when it comes to war, it's only pursued if there is no other option. Sermon 43, I have observed this matter thoroughly from all sides, but I do not find any escape except war or heresy. Either we have to fight or I give up on my religion. So it is a last resort, number two. Number three, delay as much as possible. Sermon number 55, I did not put off war even for a day, except in the hope that some would join me, find guidance through me, and see the light with their weak eyes. This is dearer to me than to kill them in the state of misguidance, even though they would be responsible for their actions. So Imam uses delay tactics in the hope that as the situation changes, maybe war will not be necessary. And then he also says, don't initiate, don't start a war. Be prepared, but don't start. Letter number 12, fear Allah before whom attendance is inevitable, and with other than whom there is no meeting. Do not fight except with those who fight with you. Do not get too near to your opponents on the battlefield, so that you appear eager for fighting. And do not go too far from your opponents on the battlefield, so that it looks like you are afraid of action. And do not fight until you receive my orders. And your hatred for them should not lead you to starting war before it is necessary. So Imam is saying, as much as is possible, try and avoid war, even avoid the conditions in which war might accidentally break out. When two people are too close, two armies, often things can spill over. We've seen it all the time, especially in popular literature. Number three, Imam on the etiquettes of war, he says, be brave. He talks about using tawakkul as our engine of power, Sermon 146, despite numbers, as he emphasizes in lecture number 36. And he says in Sermon 11, when galvanizing his troops, mountains may move from their positions, but you must not. Grit your teeth, lend yourselves to Allah, plant your feet firmly in the ground, have your eyes on the remotest enemy, and close your eyes to their numerical majority, and remember that succor is only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Think very carefully before engaging in combat. But once the decision has been made that this is the right thing to do, then there's no time for doubt. Sermon number 56. In the company of the Prophet of Allah, we even had to fight against our parents and our sons, our brothers, our uncles. And this continued in our faith, in submission, in our following the right path, and endurance over the pangs of pains in our fight against the enemy. Once that decision has been made, we cannot falter in that moment, because the emotions of the moment, especially when things get heated, they can make us doubt. They can cause issues within our decision-making processes. And then Imam advises us not to get lost in the passions of war as well. He says in lecture number 56, fear Allah every morning and evening, and remain apprehensive about yourself, about this deceitful world, and do not regard it safe in any case. Know that if you fear some evil, that you do not refrain yourself, and from the things that you love be warned about your passions. Therefore, for yourself, you should be a refrainer and a protector, so that you do not harm other people. What's really insightful about this lecture in particular is that when it comes to war, very few people engage in battle thinking, right, today is the day, this is the day I have decided I'm going to do my first war crime. It's very, very rare. And when you look at the psychology, if you look at what people did, Vietnam is a good example, because there's very, very detailed documented cases of what terrible things the soldiers did there. But then also, when you look at their psychology after coming back, that so many of them either committed suicide or they were on very heavy medications in order to try and get them past the fact that whenever they closed their eyes, they saw the horrors of what they did. People get consumed by the passion of the moment. So Imam is saying, start by praying to God, keep God at the epicenter, and don't get lost to your passions. And when coming to retreating, in letter 16, Imam acknowledges that there may be tactical retreats, but to run away out of cowardice, he says in Sermon 66, repeat your attacks and feel ashamed of running away, because it is a shame for posterity, and when you run from the battlefield, you run towards the fire of hell. In Sermon 124, by Allah, if you run away from the sword of today, you run towards the sword of Jahannam. So it puts things into perspective. But when there is victory, it is with profound etiquettes. Letter number 14, by the will of Allah, if the enemy is defeated, do not kill the one who runs away. Do not strike the helpless person. Do not finish off the wounded one. Do not inflict pain on women, even if they attack your honor with filthy words. These are the etiquettes of war as per the Imam, that are so forward that even today they're not fully respected. And when Imam wins, there is no joy over his victory. He expresses so much sorrow. Lecture number 32, Sermon 173, Sermon 218. A few examples. In the interest of time, I won't mention them in detail. But all these times Imam wins, but he doesn't express jubilation. Because how can he when the ground is littered with the corpses of mu'mineen and of people who fought against him? And he did this in practice as well. In Sharh Nahjul Balgha, there's that famous example that when he killed Amr ibn Abd Wud, the great enemy of Islam, that his sister, Amr's sister, came out of the tents to come and see what had happened, who was the killer of her champion of a brother. And when she saw that his armor, which was full of jewels and riches, had not been touched, she recites poetry praising the killer of her beloved brother, because that man was none other than Ali ibn Abi Talib. Imam also says in this heat, don't repeat the mistakes of the past. After he is struck by Ibn Muljim, lecture number 47, he saw what devastation the weaponization of the assassination of Uthman ibn Affan brought upon the Muslims. So he says that I do not want to see any of you, O sons of Abdul Muttalib, plunging harshly into the blood of the Muslims, shouting, Amir al-Mu'mineen has been killed. Kill no one on account of my being killed except my killer. And finally, moral superiority. Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, as Ibn al-Hadid records in his Sharh of Nahjul Balgha, when he took the water at the Battle of Siffin, and he stopped Imam's men from getting it. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he turned to his men, he gave a letter, a sermon number 51, galvanizing them to action. And then he put Imam Hussein alayhi salam in power of a squadron, and he said, go and get the river back. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he charged with these men. He managed to push Muawiyah's forces away from the river. Now, there is the morality of Muawiyah. And then after, remember they're fighting in a desert. There's no other access to water. Muawiyah has no choice but to come to Imam Ali. And despite previously refusing to let Imam have any water, he now asks for water for himself and his own troops. What does Imam Ali do? He says, give them whatever water they want. And they say, Ya Ali, just moments ago, he did not give you the same courtesy. Imam said, they are human beings, and even if they have acted inhumanely, I cannot follow their example. I cannot refuse a human any food or any water, even if he is my worst enemy. These are the etiquettes of Imam Ali when it comes to war. And over tonight's discussion, we've been looking at a number of examples, but again, when we open up the pages of this glorious work, there are so many more details there, so many more examples. But there is, particularly in this last tale pertaining to the etiquettes of war, there is an irony that permeates. Because it is Imam Hussein alayhi salam who is in charge, who manages to go and get water for his thirsty camp. On that day, it was destined that Imam would be successful in bringing back the water. But that same Imam would face a day that when his greatest warrior went to get the water from the river, from the descendants of the people that cut the water off from his father, that unfortunately he would not be able to bring it back to the camp. And the destiny of his family and his followers in that land of Karbala, they would be destined for thirst.